Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and welcome you, even if more people are starting to continue to trickle in. It's great to have you here at this webinar. We are organizing this as Stanford's program on democracy and the internet, the program on philanthropy and civil society, and the Institute for Human-Centered AI. So as you can see, we do a lot more than just computer science. My name is Marietje Schaake. I'm an International Policy Director at the Cyber Policy Center and an International Policy Fellow at the Institute for Human-Centered AI. And I just want to, before we start, thank Haifa, Seb, Michelle, and David for their very hard work, mostly behind the scenes, to make this session run smoothly. Now, the topic of today, technology and geopolitics, EU proposals for regulating rights, security, and trade. We can see that there's really an overwhelming amount of activity happening in this space in the EU with the AI Act, a Digital Services Act, and now also a fresh off the press, newly announced CHIPS Act on semiconductors, which was mentioned during yesterday's State of the Union address by European Commission President von der Leyen. What we see in general is that the European Union is often the first mover when it comes to regulatory proposals to protect data, to ensure free competition, or to anchor other principles in law in relation to the impact that technology has on our societies, economies, and security. And with its market size and with its population size, what happens in the EU often causes ripple effects around the world. And at the Cyber Policy Center, we feel strongly about bringing experts together to shed light on initiatives coming out of Brussels. As a former member of European Parliament, the whole policy field is close to my heart, but to also help you all pierce through stereotypical descriptions or hypes, headlines, myths, to help you make sense of what specific policies might look like, what they can mean for your work as academics, for your rights as a citizen, or for your business as you're running a company, for example. So thank you for joining us today. We welcome your participation and questions. Please ask them via the Q&A function, and we will get to as many of them as possible. We have, I should say, a phenomenal lineup of experts today. We've spread them over 3 panels with specific focus in each one of them, and a brief break between panels to stretch your legs, make a coffee or another drink, look outside the window a little bit so that it's not too much of a stretch. I'm really happy that Tyson Barker of the German Council on Foreign Relations has agreed to lead the next panel, which will zoom in on trade and transatlantic related topics. And of course, for the last panel, very thrilled that Jackie Schneider, who is at our own Hoover institution, has accepted the invitation to lead the panel on geopolitics and security. The moderators will each introduce speakers in their respective sections so that it's not a long list of bios that you will hear. But for now, I would like to start the first panel with questions for Juha Heikkilä, who is advisor on artificial intelligence in the European Commission, Nicolas Petit, who is focusing on export and competition policy, economic regulation, law and technology at the European University Institute in Florence. And then I hope that Rumaan Chaudhry has joined us. Yes, you're here, great, thank you for joining. She is a celebrated data scientist and expert at the intersection of AI and humanity, now working for Accenture, among other places. So thanks everybody for joining us. Let me start with a question for Juha. When you are assessing the AI Act that you know inside out and that you've worked on, the regulatory steps that stand out and are hotly debated. So a risk-based approach, how to make sure that AI doesn't have unintended consequences, while at least in the United States, I hear much less of the aspirations to see more growth in the EU, even if that is also part and parcel of this AI Act that is now going through the legislative process. Can you say a little bit more about how, on the one hand, regulation and on the other hand, growth can go together, and what types of trade-offs have been made in the process of putting this act together?
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, good evening even. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's great to be on this illustrious panel. I would perhaps say a few things which I think are worth highlighting. So firstly, the AI Act is meant to be proportional, and because, as most of you may know, it is risk-based. It doesn't target AI as such. It targets certain uses of AI. So it addresses those uses of AI which are considered to be high risk, and there are certain measures for those. It does, in fact, ban a small number of uses which are considered to be so harmful that they should not be allowed. But the great majority of uses of AI are, in fact, then free to develop and to deploy and to use. So it only targets those kinds of uses which we think would be harmful, which would be detrimental, and which are then better regulated. I think it's also worth mentioning that although the approach is called risk-based, it is not just about risks, it's also about opportunities. So the kind of balance between innovation and protection is very important in the considerations that we have, and we've had in the preparation of this act. But the way we see it is that in order for the benefits of AI to materialize, we need uptake. We need uptake of this technology, which I think we all agree has many beneficial uses. But that uptake does not happen if we don't have trust in this technology. So uptake requires trust. It's the sine qua non. We need to have this technology used and deployed. So we want the benefits to materialize. So therefore, we want this technology to be used in safe, predictable environment with confidence. So that's the kind of rationale behind it. It is supposed to be proportionate. It is meant to be proportionate and take into account those uses which are harmful, but let innovation thrive, let the uses and applications to be developed, which can bring great benefits to us. So that, in a nutshell, if you like, is the approach, the rationale behind it.
Thank you. It's very helpful, and I hope we can go into the details with more questions from participants. Next, let me move to Nicholas. You have a wide scope in your work. You look at the economy, at competition. Can you say a little bit more about how you see this risk-based approach of the AI Act, but also the rights-based approach that the EU is so well known for when it looks at regulatory initiatives around technology? Is it delivering? Is it creating enough innovation, more competition? Are you seeing benefits and effects, or is it too early to tell? Can you reflect from your expertise on what you think the impact is really in the EU of all these new regulatory plans?
So the short answer to your question is that it's probably way too early to make an assessment of proposals which are still in the legislative pipeline, and on which there's still a considerate amount of discussion to be had. But of course, I know that the time in the digital age is something very different from time probably in the 1950s, and we want results fast. I want to say maybe in relation to what was said by Juha earlier, that I was one of the members of this high-level expert group that prepared reports for the European Commission to help the Commission think about a framework for AI. And this group was very diverse. We had computer scientists, people from industry, people from law like me, and social scientists as well, and experts in policymaking. And I think from the get-go, it was pretty clear that there was indeed a moral ambition to the exercise, which was to make sure that the core values on which the European Union is built remain protected in the age of AI. But at the same time, there was also a realistic concern to not disincentivize innovation in AI technologies, and a concern fueled by an understanding that this is mostly a US-China competition, and the EU has, to some extent, not so much space at this table. And so I think this was very clear in our work, and this is reflected in sort of twin or dual set of approaches that you can see in the AI Act, which is, on the one hand, this very strong focus on human rights, and on the other hand, this very important concern to safeguard innovation incentives and efforts to develop these technologies in Europe. And to be very concrete on this, because all too often the European Union pronounces high-sounding concepts, which are very often, and this is, I know it's a constraint of the political policy-making exercise, but which are often a bit empty. I think a very concrete way in which you can see that, and you can see that in the draft AI Act, is I think there is in the AI Act, and that's something that's very helpful, there is a clear and intelligible approach. It says it's risk-based. We know risk-based regulation from other areas like biotechnologies and others. And so that is understandable for the business community. What are we trying to do with that? So in other words, you won't expect an avalanche of detailed and technical regulation. And second thing on which also sends, I think, right signals, maybe the Commission cannot say that so as clearly as me, I'm not a Commission official, so I have maybe less constraints in the way I can speak, is this AI Act or this instrument is really traditional. It's based on scores and even lorries of existing legislation in the product safety area. So, and the annexes contain references to this instrument. So there's no revolution here. We're building on what exists. And so what I mean to say by that, and I'll close here, is in the high-level expert group, this is an anecdote, and I don't think it's confidential, but at some point, some people wanted the group to provide a compliance guide for developers in relation to AI. And we said, we're not going to do that. Because first, it's very complicated to do that. We're not going to, write a manual to make a safe AI. But second, we said, this is going to scare off a lot of people if they have to go through thousands of pages telling developers what you can do, what you cannot do, and what you could do conditionally. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. It's very helpful. And it's also interesting to hear you saying, well, it's actually building on traditional types of regulation. It's very, brick and mortar. It's about industrial data. It's about trucks. It's about transport. Whereas other people, and I'll come to that in my next question for Rumaan, have sort of declared the EU's sense of direction completely misguided. So for Rumaan, the following question: when you zoom out, and for example, taking the US as the point of perspective and reference, we hear people like Eric Schmidt of the AI Council in the US, formerly with Alphabet, saying that the EU is making a huge mistake with the AI Act, and that generally regulating is coming too early and it's completely misguided. And it's actually not just Eric Schmidt who says this. We hear quite a bit of criticism that it might be the wrong moment or the wrong approach to regulate. What do you see personally, and what are you hearing? Can you make sense of those comments, or do you appreciate what's happening in the EU? And thanks for joining us.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. So a couple of thoughts. One is also that you likely have a partner in the United States government starting to build out, similar, pathways into regulation. We have the FTC making some very strong and bold moves, and have recently announced an entire privacy and data commission that they're launching. So I think some of those comments are actually not necessarily what the current administration, I don't want to put words in their mouths, but they have been very pointed in talking about things like the harms of AI and specifically pointed about fairness and algorithmic bias. So I don't know how founded those statements really are. I'll also say, as a social scientist, I tend to look at things from incentive structures, right? So is it too early? I don't know. It depends on what your end goal is. What I can say concretely is we already have had large scale harms happen, whether it's the UK and Ofqual, automated student examinations leading to disparate negative impacts, whether we talk about, healthcare allocations happening incorrectly, so very specifically, one with COVID-19 allocations to hospitals, where we saw districts that were primarily low-income Black and Hispanic, algorithmically receiving less money than more affluent areas, and so on and so forth. And we've seen prison systems implementing AI. We've seen people incorrectly arrested for crimes that they did not commit because of facial recognition. And we're also seeing from the bottom up facial recognition moratoria. So while at the top level, people may be debating on one sense, at least in the United States, we're also seeing a big bottom up effort to start regulating and to start, taking action. The US's approach, of course, is slightly different. There are a lot of moratoria happening, straight bans, and protections, but it's, I personally, from a practitioner's perspective, would say that I like a risk-based approach. So there's a couple of reasons why. One is that a risk-based approach is very much in alignment with how companies do work today. It is helpful for me to be able to work with risk and compliance officers in the companies I work in and have a counterpart in a common shared language. That is very difficult when engineers try to talk to risk and compliance folks or legal folks, we have to act like as a bridge. Second is a lot of these things are implementable and actionable. And that has always been the big criticism of ML ethics by engineers, is to say, well, we don't have anything to tangibly do. Even if I believe what you are saying, tell me what I need to do. And that is a very fair criticism. So this starts to head in that direction. So a couple of concerns I may have is a risk-based framework may be a little bit too narrow. So when we talk about risks, we are in a world of being reactive, and we're not necessarily in a world of always being proactive. And that is a concern I have. The second thing about, and this is not necessarily a risk-based approach in general, but an algorithmic audit-based approach is, and again, I speak of having done this for years, we look at individual models and individual capacities. And when harms occur, they actually occur in context of a socio-technical system. So what does that mean? It means that many of these approaches aren't necessarily thinking about a systems level bias. Really great example is a paper I have with Dr. Mona Sloan and Dr. Manny Moss, and we look at hiring algorithms and how they exist in a chain. So it is not a single hiring algorithm that is biased. And once hiring algorithm exists in a chain, 1, to source candidates, 2, to vet resumes, 3, maybe there is facial recognition or voice detection being used to determine culture fit or trustworthiness, so on and so forth. Any given algorithm or model can be tested for fairness, but in the system, it can only be as fair as the weakest model that preceded it. And that's really important to think of. And we don't really have necessarily good approaches to start thinking about systems level bias. So my feedback would be, I think a risk-based structured approach is the right way to start, but also let's be a little creative and start pushing the envelope a little bit and thinking more about harms and human rights-based approaches.
Thank you. Actually, this whole bottom-up approach and sort of city level, state level initiatives that we see in the US is really interesting after a period of very hands-off visions and preferences from the United States. Are you imagining that, for example, in 5 years, there will have been any federal type regulations around AI, or do you think that this bottom-up push and more civil society-led often too efforts are going to lead to a bit more of a fragmented regulatory landscape in the US?
That's a really great question. It's very hard to say, I'm going to be honest. I can think of multiple different scenarios. For one, I think you're correct. I think we're already seeing in privacy a fragmented regulatory space, and that's very difficult to work with. However, I do think maybe there's some move towards consolidation happening as a result of that fragmentation. We have already seen a few really great algorithmic accountability bills in everywhere from the city of New York to to the House. So that's a second scenario where maybe there is actually federal government level efforts that will be successful, especially with the new administration. And again, like sort of very strong push they are making to become not just more knowledgeable in ethics, but I think just to become literally more technologically savvy, right? They are hiring more data scientists, more technologists, and also more social scientists that are good in technology. So I think it's actually a perfect storm in a good way of getting the right kinds of people in the room. And then there is another world that I'm frankly hopeful for, that we get good guidance and good regulation that will tell companies how to comply. Where I think that may happen are in the more traditional, highly regulated industries. If I were to have to guess, I would say we're going to first see some regulation in finance. I mean, if you look back at SR 11.7, which was published in 2011, it is such a forward-thinking document. It could be published today, and we would all say, like, yes, this is accurate. So I think we will probably see things happening in finance, in healthcare, and the already highly regulated industries.
Thank you. Very helpful. I wanted to come back to Juha with part of the comment that Ruman made about being proactive or rather reactive. And others, like the economist Mariana Mazzucato, have pointed out to the opportunity for governments to not only regulate markets, but also to shape markets. What type of thinking and maybe also anticipated political support did you observe in the process of putting the proposal for the AI Act on the table? I think it's always helpful to remember for people on the call that there's technologies that come up and that may, because of harms, for example, require a response. But there can also be a real forward-looking motive to actually try to create a type of outcome more proactively. And whether or not this is feasible all depends on the politics, not just on whether it's a good or bad proposal, whether there's enough support or not, but politics can be very, very shaping in this space. So Juha, can you say a little bit more about the dynamics within which this whole debate in Europe is taking place?
Okay, thanks. If I may, I'd just very briefly comment on what Ruan just raised, which was fragmentation, because maybe it's good for some of the audience to point out that the European Union is not a country; it's a union of its member states. And one of the reasons why the European Commission, the European Union, is moving ahead with a regulatory proposal is the fact that we wanted to avoid the fragmentation in this area, in this space, because we have a single market, but that single market, of course, does not function properly if we have very fragmented legislation on certain areas like artificial intelligence and the use of artificial intelligence. So that was one of the sort of motivations for us, and there were signals from some member states that they could be considering regulation in this regard, and it was obviously in the union interest to make sure, and the interest of the single market, to make sure that there is a clear set of rules which would apply across the union in all the member states. So that's actually, I think, perhaps helpful to point out. And of course, the US setup is different, but the US may then, of course, face similar issues and questions. But of course, it's a federal state, and the states have different competencies compared to the European Union member states. So it's a complex picture, but it is true, in fact, that in the US at lower levels there have been efforts, as Ruman pointed out. Now, as regards then your question, I think one thing that we like to emphasize also is that the proposed regulation is meant to create a level playing field. So it would apply equally to companies, practitioners, regardless of where they come from, what they do, whether they are big or small or medium-sized or whatever, if they want to place their products on the EU market. So that was definitely one of the sort of goals of this particular regulation, where we make sure that we have a level playing field, which applies to many other pieces of EU legislation as well, of course. So that's one point I want to make. And then the different interests, how they were taken into account and how this was seen. We had a long consultation process before this AI Act, as we call it, the proposal for regulation was prepared. So that ran for months last year. After the publication of the so-called white paper, which outlined our thinking first, this was in February last year. And then the consultation, we got a great number of contributions to that, more than 1,200, coming from all kinds of organizations, from citizens, from civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, and many, many companies took part in it. And those contributions have then flown into our thinking, taken into account in our thinking. So, as Nicola mentioned, this high-level expert group that we have, the independent high-level expert group that we set up, that has inspired our proposal to a large extent, but it's been further refined. Of course, the recommendations of the high-level expert group, they were not meant to be a regulatory proposal to begin with, but the thinking there and some of the ideas, the principles, the key requirements, and the overall approach was something that we were very inspired by. And then, of course, we put this forward. We got feedback from this consultation. And of course, we are approached all the time from different kinds of organizations who want to discuss and bring things to our attention. So in that sense, level playing field, different interests were taken into account in this to make sure that it's also innovation friendly as we see it.
Thank you. In some ways, you're saying we've organized the bottom-up process, which often happens in the European Commission. Nicola, I will come back to you. You mentioned in your first reply that, to some extent, there's a lot of elements of more traditional industries and regulations found back in the AI Act. Here's a question from the audience, which is, how will the small startups, software developers, necessary for innovation cope with the burden of, for example, third-party certification before their product is put on the market? And then a follow-up question, maybe related to that, is regarding fragmentation. Individual member states might enforce requirements, and how will the uniform application be assured? In other words, how can there be an avoidance of too much of a burden for smaller companies, as well as that same fragmentation, which seems to be a theme that is coming back, not so much in what kind of proposals, but rather how the proposals might be enforced?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and no doubt there's transaction costs to new regulation being rolled out, compliance costs, essentially. I think the good news here is the idea of working with conformity assessments and European conformity approval means that compliance in one area leads to freedom to operate in the single markets. So you avoid the fragmentation, which prevents startups to scale. You avoid the legal fragmentation that would prevent startups to scale. In addition, the specialization of these organizations in relation to the industry sector in which these startups will operate will allow them to have a dialogue with peers in a way, which will avoid the risk that a distant regulator, central regulator, or distant regulators without industry-specific expertise would start to entertain a compliance discussion. I think the risk is more in another sort of detail, which is we're going to task these institutions, which are in the, as you said, the nuts and bolts of industry applications, to do human rights assessments. I'm not sure the capabilities in these small agencies are in place to do these human rights assessments. I think that's a problem. If you allow me one last remark, and that ties to something that you have said, the problem that the European Commission faces to some extent is that it can do a lot to harmonize legal obstacles across the European Union, so obstacles created by different legislations in every country, France, Germany, and so on. But the problem that Europe has is that it doesn't really have a single market insofar as private players are concerned. So what I mean to say here is something to be very clear. If you're a startup and you're in France and you want to launch in Italy, it's going to be very hard to use your French bank to finance your activities in Italy, for instance, to buy property and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of chances that the French bank will have minimal presence in Italy. So a lot of the European industry is still organized on national basis. And that is a huge impediment, a huge practical impediment to scaling small startups, probably even more than legal obstacles.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very useful remark. I think people sometimes overlook how different language areas, different legal areas per country are still very much a reality. And then when they hear proposals from the EU, they don't appreciate that those two have to match, and that's the political struggle that we often end up in. Roman, I wanted to turn to you for a question from the audience. The question is, hi, thank you for the discussion. While the need for regulation is undisputable, I will differ on the assessment that developers cannot understand or handle project compliance, as at the end of the day, they are the ones implementing it anyway. I worked with the French gendarmerie on digital contact strategy, and the project implementation made it that I handled security data and data certification. What is needed, though, is clear legislation and proper acculturation. What would be, in your view, the best way forward on this subject? So basically the role of developers and yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a really wonderful question. I'm in agreement with you, Dora. I think developers can absolutely handle, and project compliance is actually a very standard part of, good software development, right? What is now difficult, and I'm glad you brought up privacy and security, because the field of ethics is where the field of privacy and security were 10 to 15 years ago. We have no standards in our industries. We have no norms. When people use the word audit, it ranges from a short checklist of things to do to a full-blown proprietary analysis software. On one end, people audit by looking at output. On the other end, some people say they can't do an audit unless they have access to data and code. And all this is to say, it's not that one is better than the other, et cetera. I have my opinions, others have theirs, but the point is I have agreement. And, if I were to give a criticism of some of the legislation that I have seen come forward in the US, it's that, a lot of folks call for audits, but they do not tell us what an audit entails. What that introduces is a very dangerous place where, lobbyists and political actors can now advocate for their version of what an audit is, which, surprise, always complies with what would make them look the best, right? So it is actually a worse and more dangerous place if we pass general legislation on quote audits without defining what those terms mean. So I absolutely agree with you, Dora, that we do need clear legislation. To the second point about acculturation, education has been something that folks have been talking about for a very long time. So the question is, why hasn't education hit or worked? And this is a bigger question that supersedes algorithmic ethics or technology and ethics. And one can ask the same question of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a lot of other fields in which we have invested so much in quote education and not really see the needle be moved. What we are looking at, so I currently work at Twitter. I lead a team called Meta, Machine Learning, Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability. Our approach to education is twofold. One is there is a general level of education one needs to understand the importance of the work, but then there is a second and customized level of education that actually needs to go hand in hand. And it's, I guess if I were to use a different word, it's not education, it's training. And those are two very distinct things. Education is me showing the value of the work, why we need to worry about algorithmic ethics and what software developers need to do to get on board. Training is how one utilizes the tools that are in existence and specific techniques in order to achieve those goals, now that we have all agreed that we want to achieve, a world in which we're making better algorithms. I see a lot of education. I see very little training. It is very helpful, that folks like, the 360 teams at IBM, for example, provide excellent training for all of their open source notebooks. There are a lot of startups and companies that are trying to do this as well. I would love to see training being a component of what we talk about when we talk about ML ethics education.
Thanks. I want to build on your answer and ask everybody, what a realistic path forward is when there is such a big gap between the realities of engineers and data scientists that you also just, explained that they may need different kind of training, but also clarity on where the guardrails might lie. There's others who say, well, it's all good and well, but we don't want to live in a world where engineers end up deciding what the guardrails are, because that, would not be good for democracy. We need to have the public interest and then making sure that companies comply, not only those who are interested in complying, but also those who may be sort of the worst students in the class, to stick with the metaphor. So what practically, I'm asking everyone, do you see as a useful path forward to make sure that the legislative reality in the democratic public interest and the technological engineering reality, which is, where the sausage is made, can actually come together in a more constructive, structural way? Roman, if you want to start, that's fine. Or yeah.
Sure. No, I'm happy to. It's actually something I give quite a lot of thought to as somebody who sort of lives in both worlds. In my background, I've always been an applied AI engineer and developer and a product person, but my background is in quantitative social science, and policy means a lot to me. And what I find is, going back to the concept of education, I do think that there are things that both sides need to learn and need to think about. So I also have a report with Dr. Mona Sloan that was funded by the Northeast Big Data Hub, and it's on AI procurement. So this is a very narrow component of what we're talking about here, but I think the findings sort of broadly apply as we're thinking about policy, public use of artificial intelligence and ML systems and what that means. So it's online, it's aiprocurement.org, and in it we talk about certain narrative traps. In other words, things we always say when we talk about public use of technology that are actually either falsehoods or things that lead us down the wrong direction, and also some actionable items and things we need to think about. So specifically, I'd like to highlight a few of the narrative traps, and a lot of them are actually around incentives and incentive structures. Fundamentally, when we're thinking about using technology in the public good and or for public use, we have this idea that everybody has to be aligned on incentives. And that's actually not true. Everyone's not going to be aligned on incentives. People who are starting companies want to be profitable and want their companies to grow. Legislators who are responsible and accountable to the public want to ensure that, that individuals are not being harmed. This is not a normative judgment. I'm not saying that, people who start companies are all evil people who don't care about people. It's just, there are professions and paths we've chosen in our lives, and we are incentivized in particular ways. So I think, respecting and understanding what everyone's incentives is really important here. I saw a question in the Q&A about what will startups do, right? And I always think that's a very, very valid question. We don't want to create a world in which we are regulated to the extent that there are market monopolies. The problem is actually not that innovation will be stifled. It's actually that there will only be 2 to 3 companies that are able to meet all these hurdles. And that's a worst case scenario than innovation being stifled. We want startups to become the next unicorns. We also want to make sure it's done safely and securely. So with that framing and that mindset, how do we then start thinking about moving forward, with legislation, with regulation that's meaningful and actionable? And I feel like, we've sort of opened up almost like a Pandora's box of issues and problems to be discussed, but all very worthwhile ones.
Yeah, you're right. I do think it's a Pandora's box. Juha, can I turn to you for some additional thoughts?
Yeah, so my thoughts on that. I think there is a sort of growing sentiment that it is good for the practitioners in the field to be aware of the ethical and policy and regulatory aspects. And I think there is a growing realization on their part also that this technology or this family of technologies, AI, is such that it needs to bring in additional considerations rather than technological considerations. And I think that this is also something that has featured quite prominently in discussions in different forums and in different groups. On the other hand, what I've seen also from my contacts with people who work in this area is that that you mentioned the fact that we really want the engineers to decide. I have a feeling that at least many comments I've heard is that they wouldn't want to do that either. They feel that the policymakers should decide then what is right, and they kind of are reluctant to sort of have an engineering solution to something which is ultimately not an engineering question, if you like. So I think these are the kinds of things, and I think that the sort of exchanges between these two sides is very valuable. I see it in my work because we deal also, the European Commission is also a funding agency, as some of you may know. So we do actually fund a lot of research and innovation in artificial intelligence and robotics and related technologies. And of course, from our perspective, it's helpful to see also what's going on in the field here, what is possible, what is not possible on the one hand, but also then explain to the practitioners what kinds of policy and regulatory considerations there might be.
Thank you. Nicolas.
It's a hard question. I work at a university. I think we should, to be very concrete, we should promote educational programs in law and ethics for computer scientists, and programs in computer science for lawyers and policymakers. That's how we can move the needle. I'm hopeful because I see this activity taking place. And also I want to just, remind maybe the audience of something, which is that we don't really live in the world of Kurt Vonnegut's cat's cradle, where scientists innovate without any concern for the massive social damage they are doing to the world. And I think a lot of computer scientists, the ones I've met in my courses, very young, they have ethical conscience, and they are on the demand side for training and education, and often they avail themselves of that. So I think the challenge mostly is not so much to supply the information to computer scientists, but to supply it in a readable and intelligible way. And so this is the messaging and the packaging of the information really matters.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. And a lot of work to do really from both sides, something we also contribute to from Stanford. Another question is from Alex Engler, who says, I believe that many of the requirements on AI services, those not included in product safety legislation, require only self-certification unless there is post-market surveillance by the member states. Is that impression right? What do the panelists expect that post-market surveillance to look like? I think I'll start briefly with Juha and then come back to Nicolas, and Ruman, you can add if you have thoughts. Go ahead.
So the proposal that the European Commission has made is actually a sort of life cycle relevant proposal. And post-market monitoring is a part of it, in fact, and providers are actually expected to actively collect, document and analyze relevant data on the reliability, performance and safety of the AI systems throughout their lifetime. So it's not just like one-off and then it's done forever. And then and on that basis evaluate the continuous compliance with of the system or use with the regulation. And there is also what is also planned is an incident reporting system on malfunctioning and breaches of fundamental rights. And there could be then a new conformity assessment if substantial modifications are needed. So there is this aspect included that it has to be continually then monitored. I should also perhaps add one aspect which has not been mentioned, which was kind of touched on by Ruman. It's the kind of reactive, proactive aspect. What we have planned in this proposed regulation is also to have updates. So the list of high-risk use cases, which, if you like, is the most interesting and critical one from many perspectives, that is meant to be updated. So it's not fixed forever, because obviously, as we all know, we are dealing with a very rapidly advancing technology, which is changing. 5 years ago, it was different. 5 years from now, it will be different. So therefore, the update mechanism has been built in. It's part of it because it was felt to be necessary.
Thank you. Any additions from Nicola or Ruman?
Thank you for clarifying about the proactive nature. I'm really excited to see sort of the next wave roll out. I'm, curious to see, some of the I know this may be a little bit off topic with the question, but in terms of like identifying high risk areas, one thing, as a product developer, and somebody trying to lead a team to do this work, one thing I would really love to see is just a generalized framework of risk identification, rather than saying, we have decided these are sort of high risk areas that need to be somehow, and there's going to be decisions made on what level of regulation, especially, since I work for a social media company today, we are not necessarily a high risk quote industry. Well, we're not a high risk vertical in the traditional sense, but there's definitely a lot of discussion on the impact of social media that's very, very valid. What would be really wonderful and useful for someone like myself is the ability to say, here is a framework of risk identification for models or for our systems that we're creating that's sort of generally useful, even if it is independent of regulation. So just to put that out there, it'd be something that'd be really, really wonderful to see moving forward. And I'm really glad that there's this proactive component to it.
I would love to pick up on where you left, Roman, because there has been some criticism that the current AI Act looks at how AI is applied and whether that leads to risk, and doesn't look at sort of foundational AI models or models that can be applied in a variety of outcomes and settings and the risk there. So maybe we can look at that point before concluding this panel, because I think it is actually quite a fundamental point that people are making. I've heard from engineers who say, we cannot make such a distinction between the application of artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence as such, particularly as it develops so rapidly. So if you have additional thoughts there, is that also what you're trying to get at, sort of risk assessment more broadly?
Yes and no. So I agree in the sense that there are sort of fundamental baked in biases that can exist in models. But it is also the case that doing an audit fully upstream of the code does not absolve the need to do a context-based assessment, right? So I guess to give a better example of what I'm saying, I can decide to create a large language model that is quote unquote not biased, but if I want to use it in a particular setting or in a particular country or for a different language, there will be contextually introduced biases. The other thing I'd say is, the further upstream you go, the broader the field of the potential harms and biases are. And this is where, to put on an engineer's hat for a minute, this is where it becomes like an insurmountable task. Like, it is very valid that folks will sometimes say, I can't think of everything. I can't think of everything this is going to touch and every potential way someone's going to be upset about this. And that is also a valid concern. So yes, I think there are some very fundamental problems we can stop at the core, but also there is a need for understanding a context-based approach. What that does not necessarily mean is a ton of onerous regulation. It actually just means being smart and targeted about what you will look at and when in the product development lifecycle. There is no point in auditing data once a product is already rolled out. The smart time to audit data is in the very beginning of product development, right? Because that's actually when you can do something about it and it's not going to be a serious task. So that's really more of what I'm advocating for, but I do agree with that sentiment.
Thanks. I think it's helpful for people who are relatively new to this too. Any additional thoughts by Nicola or Juha on this?
Yeah, Marietje. So one thing which, so another practical concern, if you think about the industry economics and the industry structure. So some providers of AI services develop general purpose software and sell that to other companies, which then turn this into a more applicational tool, which might then create the sorts of problems that are described in the AI Act. So, the question here and the conundrum is who should comply? And is the general purpose developer in charge of all this, or is this falling back on the shoulders of the clients who license it in the software, for instance? And so these questions are practical questions, but they are creating some questioning in industry and about who should do what and they are very concrete, practical questions that deserve to be addressed.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it also really calls for a flexible and adjustable working with the principles that are articulated here to serve a certain purpose. And I think there's no disagreement in the panel that, you know, avoiding risk and harms is legitimate and necessary. But with changing technologies, changing contexts, maybe questions around interpretation and enforcement, this kind of flexibility seems to be a sort of ingredient that we cannot have enough of. What is your thought, Juha? Is that feasible? You're still muted, sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I mean, these are very difficult questions, of course, and the kinds of considerations that Nicola raised. I mean, they are definitely issues that need to be solved. Maybe I just point out one thing that, you know, the way the AI Act was conceived, there are certain obligations which apply to providers on the one hand, but also obligations that apply to users, and monitoring the operations for risks, etc. That is something that is expected from the users as well. So you know, the responsibility, there are different responsibilities for different kinds of players in that value chain, and I think that I mean, I think it's fair to say, right to say that this is a very complex issue and a complex package, of course, and there are multiple issues involved, which make it hard to come up with something which is all round. But obviously, in every step of the way, we try to make sure that it does cover those things which are necessary and which are relevant, and of course, as maybe I should add this as well, because it's now, as Nicola said earlier, in the legislative pipeline. So what is now out may not be the final, will probably not be exactly the final version, because there will be discussions about it in the European Parliament and between the European member states of the European Union. So we'll see what comes out and what kinds of issues are brought to our attention. But the way we conceived it, we wanted to take into account things which we thought were relevant, and of course complications. We are aware of some of the complications. Some of them are, as Nicola pointed out, in the implementation. And of course, one thing that I should perhaps also add is that this will rely on standards for implementation. So those will then, of course, be discussed in international standardization bodies.
Thank you. I think that's a really nice segue to the rest of the program. I wish we could have spoken longer. I think there's so much to discuss, both in depth about how the technology works and how to best mitigate risks and harms, and who should be best positioned to legitimately do that with oversight. We are now going to hand over the discussion to Tyson Barker. We're taking a brief break so that everybody can, you know, move around a little bit and grab a drink or a breath of fresh air, but really be back at the hour. So in 5 minutes, to continue the discussion, which will focus more on trade and transatlantic aspects of the role of the EU in regulating around tech-related topics. So I'm going to stay on, and really am excited to listen to the next panel. Thank you to Juha, Nicolas, and Ruman for your thoughts and your time in this first panel.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Hi, am I on?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. All right, hey everybody. My name is Tyson Barker and I am the director of the Technology and Foreign Policy Program at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and I am delighted to host this discussion on digital trade. And I think we're really going to be talking about, what kind of digital world does Europe want to live in? Because of course, as we all know, trade has been one of the primary instruments with which Europe has been trying to shape the global economy. For those of you who have worked with the EU for a long time, you're probably familiar with the four freedoms of the European single market. The four freedoms are freedom of movement of goods, of movement of services, capital, and people. And since the Estonian presidency in 2017, they've added a fifth freedom to that, which is the freedom of movement of data. And truthfully, if you look at what Europe's trying to do internally and what it has traditionally tried to do globally, it has been to manage the liberalization of the movement of those five areas. And of course, in recent years, primarily since about 2017, that effort has come under strain from multiple sources. And I think that's something that we're going to talk about today. We have a great lineup of speakers. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we're going to jump right into the discussion. First, we have Josh Meltzer. Josh is from the Brookings Institution. He is a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program there, where he works on international trade law and policy issues with a focus on the WTO and large free trade agreements. He is also a former diplomat working for the Australian government. So thank you so much, Josh, for joining us. Second, we have Dmitry Grozobinski, who is the founding director of Explain Trade and a visiting professor at the University of Strathclyde's School of Law, specializing in negotiations and trade policy, and is also a former Australian diplomat and trade negotiator at the WTO. So welcome, Dmitry. Thanks for joining us. Third, we have Carl Benedict Frey, who is the Oxford Martin City Fellow at the University of Oxford, where he directs the program on the future of work at the Oxford Martin School. Thank you so much, Carl Benedict, for joining us. And finally, we have Dame Wendy Hall, who is the Regis Professor of Computer Science, Associate Vice President and Executive Director of the Web Science Institute at the University of Southampton. She is also the co-chair of the UK government's Artificial Intelligence Review, which was published in October 2017, is the UK government's first skills champion for AI, and is a member of the newly formed AI Council. So thank you so much, Dame Wendy Hall, for joining us as well. So what I'd like to do is focus on three areas. The first is Europe's role in global data governance, so the freedom of movement of data. The second is the kind of transatlantic context and how the US and EU are thinking about shaping the global digital environment in the newly formed Trade and Technology Council. And the third is what is the EU trying to do on digital and technology in multilateral settings. So let me start with a question on data and GDPR, which is a favorite topic of all of us who have been watching the EU operate in this space for a while. Josh, what is the status of negotiations between the United States and Europe on Privacy Shield, on maintaining free and open data flows of personal data? And to what extent is that tells us something about how Europe is going to be interacting with the rest of the world in data flows in the future?
Thanks, Tyson. And let me just say, Marietje, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure and an honor. And it's great to see familiar faces and old faces as well, and to meet a fellow Australian as well, Dmitry. Hi. Look, the short answer is, the negotiations are furious and fast, but haven't actually seemed to produce a result at the moment. But they're of the utmost importance, I think, and I think it's clear because as a result of Schrems 2, we all understand that essentially now we are facing a world where flows of personal data between the US and the EU are probably going to come to a halt for a lot of companies, not for everyone. I mean, this is essentially, the concern is essentially companies that may be exposed to surveillance requests, particularly in the United States. And the finding that is at odds with essentially GDPR and fundamental rights in the EU. So this affects Facebook immediately. That's what Schrems is about, but it really affects a whole range of companies that rely on large flows of data transfers between the US and the EU. So this is going to be important to resolve for both sort of trade, economic, and broader sort of diplomatic and sort of international relations reasons. On the trade and economic front, a lot of work's been done now to understand the importance of essentially cross-border data flows for trade and investment on a transatlantic basis, and it's extremely important. Clearly, I mean, there's a very robust services industry which relies on data transfers, whether it's in the financial sector, in the IT sector, and telecommunications, in just the huge cross-border foreign investment that happens in this use of subsidiaries and just the day-to-day transfer of personal data that happens just for HR reasons and so forth. Then you've got essentially the broader importance of the transatlantic relationship and this sort of goal, I think, that the US has had, and I think the US as well, in terms of using the heft of that relationship to try to set standards and directions on issues around data governance. And I think getting that piece right on privacy is going to be a core part of that, because at one level, what we've seen is the US and the EU are in different places in terms of their approach to privacy regulation. And we need to be able to show that, notwithstanding these differences, even though underpinned by a common commitment to the OECD privacy principles, that we can still enable cross-border data flows, that their different regulatory approaches does not prohibit finding ways to cohabit in a regulatory sense. And we've had successes, obviously, with previous iterations, with Privacy Shield and so forth. But the Court of Justice has set very high standards, and so it's been a continual process trying to find a way to ensure that these are sustainable. So getting that right, I think, is going to be key for the transatlantic economic relationship, and to the extent that the US and EU can forge a meaningful partnership on developing broader sort of systems of data governance going forward as well.
Thanks so much, Josh. We already have questions in the chat, and please do feel free to enter in your questions because I will pull from them. But I want to take the transatlantic issue and make it a cross-channel issue, because obviously there is a new agreement, an adequacy agreement between the UK and the EU now that the EU has left the European Union, but it's already coming under question, specifically regarding Article 22 and how it will constrain the EU or the UK's ability to deal with research and development in the area of artificial intelligence. So Dame Wendy Hall, I'd be interested to know, do you think that the UK-EU agreement is durable? And what do you see as the UK's future positioning on questions around data governance?
Well, I don't speak for the UK government. I have to stress that at all. Speaking in personal capacity as someone who understands a bit about what they do. What's Article 22? You said, particularly Article 22. What's Article 22?
Isn't this the article that deals with processing of data by algorithms, that it doesn't have human oversight?
I don't know. I mean, you're assuming I know the articles off by heart in the EU. I don't.
Well, let me maybe broaden the question a little bit.
That's fine if it is that one. Sorry, go on.
Maybe I can broaden the question a little bit. To what extent is GDPR essentially durable in any form? Because it does have exemptions for EU member states in many areas, including national security. But when countries are outside of the EU, there is a double standard that applies. So the agreements of adequacy are always going to be under question. How is a country like the UK to deal with that in the future?
Right, and I'm not an expert in this sort of area, I have to say. I mean, a lot of the things you're talking about, I don't fully understand, but I do know that since we are part of Europe, but we're not in the EU, and that the government announced 3-4 weeks ago that they were going to review GDPR. in terms of how we I don't know what the phrase is, apply it, think of exemptions. I mean, we clearly have this, the problem we always have is the EU's a big trading partner, which has been tested a bit in the last few years. But also we want to trade with the rest of the world. And the rest of the world, whilst it looks at GDPR as a gold standard in terms of how you might apply, do data protection, the rest of the world is not rushing to adopt GDPR wholesale at all. And you heard some of that from Joshua in terms of how things are stalling between the US and Europe. And also, I mean, my work is very much on a global level. I've just written a book called The Four Internets, which talks about the culture and the different of data governance and the internet governance in different parts of the world. And even if the EU and the UK, as small as we are compared to that size, and the US have agreements in this, we're tiny compared to the rest of the world, which as the internet access to the internet grows and people around the world we have about 60%. I'm sort of going to answer your question, but about 60% of the world has access to the internet now. The other 40% are largely in rural China, rural India, and rural Africa. And as they come on board, it will be in 10, 20 years' time, a very different internet to the one we have today. And the dominant country is going to be China in terms of its influence on that. So actually, Europe plus the US is quite a small part of that overall population. So we can talk about these things till the cows come home, and it might not actually. It will only help us trade with each other and not with the rest of the world. Maybe. I mean, this is the big geopolitical issue here. In our book, we talk about the fact that US is very market-led, Europe's data protection, human rights-led, and China's much more about control and surveillance. And we talk about India being the swing state. India's a huge population which is coming onto the internet now. It's a democracy with autocratic tendencies. How India behaves in this world is I think India, we call it in the book the swing state, because I think that what they do in this world is going to be really important. And well, I should probably stop there for a minute because I've gone a bit off tangent from what you actually asked me, but the UK is not kicking GDPR out, but it's definitely reviewing how it wants to apply it.
Well, you give me a lead into a question for Dimitri, because basically the world is becoming much more pluralistic, and kind of dominant governance models, including even GDPR, which, as you mentioned, was a real standard setter in many cases, and has led to some convergence on how countries and subnational entities like California think about privacy and data protection, is still bumping up against rising countries like India, like the continent of Africa, like China, which have different views of these kind of things. So what I would like to do is ask Dimitri, we have certain governance structures, first and foremost, the WTO, that have had a big role in monitoring, ironing out issues around trade and even digital services. And that role has also come under question as these new ideas of how this area is supposed to be governed have arisen. So how can the WTO continue to play a role in shaping digital services, questions around privacy, as countries like India, like China, are really challenging it with new models of governance?
Thank you so much for having me and for the question. It's a pleasure to be here. And 2 out of 5 on a panel of former Australian diplomats is a good start. Maybe next time you can find 3 more and we can have a clean sweep. Before I get to that question, maybe to just come back to the question for Dame Hall, because it's something I think about a lot. The UK finds itself in an interesting place where it will rely on its continued prosperity in part on the maintenance of a number of, frankly, fairly arbitrary adequacy decisions from the European Union, of which GDPR is one of them. At the same time, it's under a lot of pressure internally to create a more enabling regulatory environment for startups, for innovation, and for doing business. And I think something that we're seeing with this sort of automated, the GDPR right to be able to appeal an AI decision to a human, that right creates that there are cost implications to that right for businesses. But in sort of moving away from it, the UK has to consider how close does it push the European Union to the cliff edge of ending that adequacy, which on the one hand would potentially create some advantages for some EU firms. The loss of an adequacy for the UK would mean UK firms are unable to provide certain services to EU citizens. But on the other hand, it would be frankly massively disruptive. I mean, this is a digital architecture and relationships that have built up over decades. So it is, I wouldn't say it is a game of chicken, but there's certainly a lot of gray areas there. And I think that's really important.
I say we've got used to that during Brexit, just so you know.
Sweating in the gray areas is a good way to describe Brexit, I think. But to get to your question specifically, I think it's important to understand what the WTO does on everything rather than just digital. The WTO is not about forging a new consensus. It is barely even about resolving a disputed consensus. The WTO is where you go when the major players have largely arrived at a consensus through either their internal political processes, machinations, or via regulator to regulator contact. So the WTO can continue to talk about these issues. It can continue to lock in when the major players feel like that they have a consensus around something like electronic signatures or open internet. They can, through something like the e-commerce joint statement initiatives, which is a plurilateral at the WTO, attempt to lock that in with rules to prevent backsliding and to provide some predictability for business. But what the WTO is absolutely sort of not designed to do because of its processes, the way it works, is to take an issue where the major players in the world, as Dame Hall's book seems to lay out, fundamentally disagree on key issues, put them in a room and have some sort of consensus emerge. The WTO I don't think has ever successfully done that on any issue. And I don't think an issue as fast moving, as contentious and as politically charged as e-commerce is going to be where it changes that pattern.
Thank you so much. Let me turn it over to Carl Benedict. Carl Benedict Frey, what is your impression of how GDPR at home in the European Union has affected its innovation environment? Is there a first mover disadvantage to being a standard setter in the area of data protection and privacy? Has it slowed the velocity of use of personal data in the EU? And how do you see this impacting the lives of users and workers in Europe?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for your kind invitation. So I think there is an unfortunate narrative out there, which is that the more data you have, the better that is for AI development. And I think the debate is often being framed as this inherent trade-off between data privacy and innovation in artificial intelligence. And I think that's unfortunate for a number of reasons. First of all, when it comes to innovation, data is very domain specific. So it's not the case, for example, that having breaks on surveillance technology is going to yield more innovation in medical diagnostics or autonomous vehicles. There's simply not the case that surveillance data is going to lead to better technological development in domains beyond surveillance technology itself. Secondly, there are actually diminishing returns to data, and you can go as far as saying that if China is the Saudi Arabia of big data, then data might well be China's natural resource curse. What do I mean by that? Well, consider going back to 1900, where you have electric vehicles being essentially on par with gasoline powered vehicles. Along comes huge oil discoveries in the 1920s, tilts the balance in favor of the internal combustion engine at the expense of the electric car. A century down the road, we're now trying to get into electric vehicles. Imagine having had a carbon tax back in 1900. Would that potentially have tilted the balance in favor of electric vehicles and yielded more development in that space over the following 100 years? We don't know, but you can essentially see, GDPR as a tax on data. I mean, it does a lot of things, but essentially it increases the cost of storing and processing information. And what we have done is we try to look at sort of fairly systematically and look at different companies' relative exposure to GDPR. And what we do find is that actually in response to the enforcement of GDPR in 2010, innovation in Europe has increased. Now that seems sort of kind of striking at first until you think about why that is, because if you change the regulatory environment, businesses also need to change the technologies they are using to be GDPR compliant. And what we see in particular is quite a significant shift away from more data intensive approaches to artificial intelligence, like deep learning, towards more data saving approaches to artificial intelligence, like hybrids and symbolic type of AI. Now, why is that significant? Well, first of all, data or sort of data intensive AI comes with some negative externalities. First of all, if you think of in terms of the climate, these huge data centers are tremendously energy demanding. And secondly, there's an incentive in a world where data is the new oil for app developers to try to keep people engaged with their smartphone as much as possible to collect data, which is making people essentially addicted, which isn't great news. Now, I'm definitely not suggesting that GDPR is the solution to all of this, but I think the sort of change in the direction of innovation that has resulted from GDPR is something that's often being omitted in the conversation. The main concern, the way I see it, is that we've seen a negative impact, particularly on smaller companies, right? So if you look at sales and profits, what you do see is the smaller businesses are doing very poorly. Facebooks and Googles are doing rather well as a consequence. So we need to be very mindful of the regulatory burdens on smaller companies in particular, especially also because they are the ones that tend to come up with the more radical innovations. But I do think we need some correction about the narrative of the trade-offs between data privacy and innovation in AI. And I think it's also important to remember, and I think that's something that sort of goes back to the last panel, artificial intelligence is not yet a mature technology, right? There are, if you look at the United States, 2.5% of companies in the US report having adopted some sort of machine learning. And you can think of this as a parallel to the steam engine. The reason why we think as James Watt as the inventor of the steam engine is he was the first one to make it energy efficient, right? We're still waiting to have this separate condenser moment in the field of artificial intelligence. And incentivizing businesses to rely less on data is a good first step in that direction.
Well, let me take that point and kick it to Dame Wendy Hall, because we have a question from the chat that asks about, a point that Carl Benedict Frey just made, which is, does this create conditions for consolidation in industry? Does this kind of regulatory, as he said, a kind of covered tax that GDPR is, tend to favor big incumbents or big players that then become incumbents, like platform companies? Are we seeing something similar in AI, and how do we avoid that? Is that something that you are seeing in the AI Act, in other regulatory environments, as people are starting to think about regulating other new technologies that are more algorithmically centered? You're on mute.
Were you asking, Tyson, were you asking that to me?
Correct.
That was quite a complicated question. And I mean, I say not an expert in the AI Act at all. I know of it, but I will answer. So I think that when you're thinking globally, I think an example, let me say two things. One, I have huge respect for Europe for running this experiment. Okay, and I loved what Carl, I mean, I'm really enjoying being on this panel. I come and do these things because I learn so much and I meet so many interesting people. And I love what Carl just said. You know, it saves me reading his paper. You know, fabulous analysis. And yes, Dimitri said it all better than I could, so you should go to him next. But let me give you, so I think we're effectively running examples, and the EU, as I say, is very brave to run this example. And others can learn from it and adopt it potentially, and how it works in their cultures. There are other examples going on around the world as we speak. I want to just use an example of a technology which we haven't touched on yet today. They didn't touch on it in the first panel, and that's face recognition. You could also give another example of deep fakes in video, where two extremes. Face recognition is gradually coming into every world, right? The latest release was India's using it across India to catch the criminals. China's already obviously using it and developed a lot of the technology to recognize people's faces even with masks on, because they were there before us with COVID, before COVID with wearing masks. I don't know which states in the US allow it. Well, I think California said no face recognition. I believe, I'm not an expert in what the different states do. In the UK, you know, our police forces are experimenting with it. And this is a global thing. As we move around, when COVID lets us around the world, we will move between different jurisdictions. What are our rights, and who's managing that at a global level as to what different countries? When I go to India, what can India do with my face, right? I know China, as soon as you walk into China, I can't remember now, it's 2 years ago, you know, they take a picture of you straight away and you're in their system. And I know as I walk around UK cities, I'm in those systems, and I don't know how prevalent it is in Europe, but this is something where there's no global regulation. And so who does that? Who manages that? Is that the question you were referring to? And then this is my point, is that whilst we can run effectively local experiments, this is a global world, and there is no, and I don't think there should be a body that you know, it's not going to be the UN. It's not going to be a we can't do it with climate, so it's going to be very hard to do it with this. But I do think the thing I want to say at this point, and then I'll shut up, is that I like to think about how we manage finances and financial regulations, which we've developed over, you know, a couple of centuries, and we have each jurisdiction has its own sort of set of regulations, but there are internationally recognized regulations to enable you know, global markets and companies to act in different countries. And I think that we will have to evolve something like that for AI algorithms. And I also want to go, what Rumman said in the first panel is that, you know, you can't think of AI without thinking about the data that feeds. If you're talking about machine learning, the data that feeds it. So you need to have the regulation for the data. You need to check, what did she actually say? You need to audit the data early in the process, not after you've written the algorithms. You know, we are miles away from sorting this out. So bravo to the EU for running the first big experiment. We will learn.
All right, running the first big experiment, you pointed to the financial services sector and financial services governance. And of course, two aspects that occur to me immediately when we think of financial services governance is one, the use of risk and how risk is built into the regulatory system. And the second is, and audits, of course. Yeah. And the second is a major trend also around the same time of, you know, great global liberalization, but the removal of capital controls. And what we're seeing right now, at least on the data side, is a much more movement towards data localization. So my question for Josh is, how do we bridge this question around risk and data localization? How do we move more towards that openness, but a better, more efficient way of dealing with data that protects resilience and obviously protects human rights?
Well, there's a lot in that question, Tyson.
He asked very complicated questions.
Yeah. You know, I think, I mean, to Carl's point before about, you know, the importance of data in AI, I mean, I think a couple of, like, I agree with a lot of what he said, to the extent that I think this dichotomy between regulation and innovation is clearly a false one, and smart regulation can actually very much be enabling of innovation. And we may be seeing some of that in the EU as they seek to essentially innovate around the challenges of GDPR and the direction that GDPR is pointing towards, which may be AI, which is more around logical systems and less intensive in terms of data. But I think it's also true that currently a lot of the AI applications still are very data intensive and require a lot of large data sets, labeled data sets, and so forth. And there's a lot of parallel work going on in both areas. And you know, the incentive structure, which Ruman talked about before, is important here. And GDPR is obviously changing that for developers in the EU. When this issue around access to data, I think, is also, you know, embedded in, if you look at the EU, you know, essentially, you know, the proposed data strategy, you know, this addresses not just access to public data sets, but also data sets held by the private sector, creating data pools. And so I think there's a genuine sense in the EU, at least, that access to data, in at least when one thinks about various applications of AI, will continue to remain important, and that access to that data is going to be part of essentially opening up opportunities for innovators to come in, use it, play with it, and develop new AI systems. Now, it remains unclear how this will actually play out in reality, but I think there's a growing sense that access to data remains important. Now, the data localization piece, I think, cuts in there to some extent in various different ways, because it is both about access to data, but it's also about infrastructure. And we haven't spoken about infrastructure, and I don't think that the previous panel did all that much as well. But when you think about the AI stack, certainly the infrastructure piece, I think, is increasingly understood as being key. It's very expensive and increasingly expensive to run the algorithms, to actually process the data to make sense of it, whether you're doing ML or something more sophisticated. And providing researchers and small businesses opportunities and access to sort of world-class sort of infrastructure, whether it's federated learning in the cloud, whatever it may be, is going to have to be part of that. And now the data localization piece essentially requires both building infrastructure locally, often depending on how that data localization is framed, as well as storing that data locally. Now, you can have various flavors of data localization, from keep a copy locally but allow data to flow, through to like a full kind of restriction on even being able to move that data globally. Then there are a couple of elements that this is something which has been sort of a focus. I mean, bringing it back, I guess, to some of what we were talking about earlier in terms of trade governance and how that can be relevant for thinking about the broader data governance piece in AI. Certainly, that's been something that trade policy has sought to get at by trying to limit data localization with sort of room for appropriate exceptions. But at least in terms of the AI piece and also the infrastructure piece, there is, you know, this is orthogonal in many respects. It raises costs of the types of foundational technologies that are needed, including for cloud computing, which a lot of AI is built upon. It reduces the ability to essentially collect large data sets globally. So when you want to be doing that type of ML or AI processing on global data sets, you have to be able to move data globally. It has security implications. I think, you know, the large card processors like Visa and MasterCard have made, I think, very convincing explanations about how they, you know, essentially detect cyber fraud by analyzing data across their networks, and are unable to do that in a data localized world. So there are multiple elements there that are problematic. And to conclude, and is one area I think which has been a key focus for the US and the EU. Just to finish on that, the US and the EU are not in the same place on data localization, and the UK, I think, is actually more aligned with the US in this respect, where one of the things that GDPR, I think, has hobbled for the EU, at least at this sort of trade policy level, is their ability to commit to strong rules on data localization, because there's been concern, and on data flows, because there's been concern about what this means for GDPR. So in fact, you see in their FTAs, in the WTO context as well, a lot of hesitancy on the EU, or combined with a need for a very broad exceptions carve out for any commitments they want to make. Whereas the US is a lot, and the UK and others are a lot sort of more comfortable making strong commitments with a more limited exceptions to that.
Let me change gears slightly and move into another area of trade in technology and ICT that is really kind of moving quickly, and we might see some action on this at the US-EU Trade and Technology Council in Pittsburgh. And that's the question, and this question is directed to you, Dimitri, on dual-use export controls and investment screening. What kind of trends are we seeing globally on just technology control, market access, tech access, and how is the US and the EU, particularly the EU, trying to shape that development?
So we're well past my area of expertise, to the point where I can barely see it in the rearview mirror, but I can give you an overall flavor to partially answer the question, and hope that perhaps Carl, Dame Hall, or Josh can bail me out. In terms of the investment conversation in trade, and specifically investment facilitation, which is the way that trade negotiators tend to talk about, there are really two international kind of, I would say, streams of thought. One is, I would say, very Chinese-led, which is about removing primarily arbitrary or national security-based screening to Chinese investment around the world. That is not explicitly how they say it, but that is clearly the underlying motive, where the Chinese approach and what they have been pushing through the WTO and in other places is effectively to see if they can get at some of the things like the FIRB review in Australia, which applies a national security test to large investments. That is the concern. There's a second stream of investment facilitation measures, which very deliberately stays away from that and instead focuses on investment-related sort of agreements around things that make investments more predictable and more transparent, and that kind of thing for investors. So the same kind of things that you would see in trade facilitation to move goods around, trying to introduce those same kind of, review boards, decisions in a reasonable amount of time, no unnecessary, that kind of thing. Specifically on this question of technology investment and these, from chip shortages to other places, at the moment, what we've seen is much more of a problem diagnosis than any path to a solution. The Chinese exports to the US went up in the last period of years, despite all of the talk of reshoring, despite all of the talk of moving critical manufacturing of things like semiconductors back onto US shores, all of the rhetoric of, frankly, the Trump era, but also the early Biden era. The fact is there are only, say, a number of places in the world where you can produce the ultra small semiconductors, the chips that we need. And again, I'm very far beyond my expertise. And so far, government action has not spurred to a massive reshoring or a reshaping of those lines. And I think where policymakers, both in Europe and in the US, are finding themselves is in how far can they turn the dial, both in terms of subsidizing and supporting domestic production and in terms of keeping some of these imports out before the damage that they do to their supply chains that rely on those things exceeds the benefits that they gain in terms of national security. And that is what they are, that is what they are wrestling with. And I don't think they're anywhere near sort of a solution that is outcome oriented rather than problem focused, and I think at times slightly performative. But I mean, I would very much pass this to Carl or Josh, who I'm sure have been focusing on this much more, to Dame Hall as well.
I think that's really helpful to give some flavor to how serious these discussions are and how nascent they might be. We have a question from the chat, which I'm going to give to Carl Benedict Frey, which is about data unions and data trusts. What do you think is the role? What could be created to protect and utilize personal data in the interest of the individuals to really make sure that the benefits, that the rents that come from that data is actually serving the people who are producing that data?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I mean, the data union in a way is a bit like a data tax, although it benefits the members of that particular union, but increases the price of data and could potentially have sort of similar effects of the ones that I alluded to earlier in terms of directed technological change towards sort of less data intensive approaches to AI. And let me just underscore that when I say less data intensive, it doesn't mean that there is no data involved. Obviously, data does still matter, but it mainly matters in domains where you can run sort of millions and millions of trials. And if you want to get a robot to empty your dishwasher, for example, right, you can't run a million of trials. You need to come up with approaches that allow you to work with small data sets. And one of the reasons that we don't see AI in the productivity statistics yet is that we don't have those approaches. But clearly, data is worth very little individually and can be worth something collectively. And data unions have a similar role to play as labor unions have in, allowing people to extract better rents from their labor, and people can extract potentially better rents from the data.
Thank you so much. We have another question on data governance, and I think I saw Josh typing on it, so I'm going to ask him this question. We witness louder calls for international standardization every day on data governance, and we have the UK's ICO. Maybe Dame Judy Hall would like to, or excuse me, Dame Wendy Hall would also like to address this question. Is thinking about a global data protection accord. Do we actually need a global data governance accord? Is this possible, and what would the elements look like?
Yeah, no good deed goes unpunished, I guess. Look, I think there's a lot there. So when I think about international standards, at least, I think it's useful to distinguish between sort of a more generic understanding of standards, which can almost become equated to law and regulation, and actually what's happening in international standards bodies such as the ISO and the IEC and the IEEE and the ITUT, for instance, which is much more sort of industry technically driven standard making. And at least on the latter front, there's a lot of really, I think, significant and important work going on around a whole range of topics that we've spoken about today: data governance, and sort of the various bits and pieces that are required to make data interoperable and readable globally. The formats, I mean, it's quite technical, is underway, including at even more broader sort of political social questions around AI, bias and explainability and so on and so forth are also being tackled in these now sort of very specific standards development bodies. And without going into the legitimacy and so forth, they are global, they have participation broadly, and China is engaged in them as well. So they're sort of a useful forum, I think, still for trying to build progress around these sort of technically driven processes. On the bigger question of data governance and so forth, I mean, I think given the state of the world, I don't think we are in any realistic shape to be talking about sort of a global multilateral approach to data governance, but I do think we are slowly building the pieces towards more common approaches to data governance. We're always going to end up, I think, in different places as countries, because back to my very original point about GDPR, where you had commitment to the OECD privacy principles, but ending up in very different places, there were just different path dependencies and national values and historical experiences, which are going to drive different approaches to key issues like privacy and cybersecurity that are going to reflect, just these deep and differences that we're going to have to find ways then to manage. And the US and EU sort of have managed those differences through Privacy Shield. You can think about doing something similar around issues around cybersecurity and consumer protection and so on and so forth that will begin to make the differences matter less when it comes to maximizing the opportunities of data globally, I think. But let me turn it over to you, Dan.
Wendy Hall.
I forgot what the original question was here.
Do we need a global data governance accord? And if so, what should be in it, if anything?
Well, I think the jury's out. The thing for me is there is something we haven't talked about, but there is an existing, the Global Partnership for AI, which is led by the OECD, I think, and Canada and France are leaders in it, and most of the big European AI countries, the UK, the US, Australia, are all part of that. It includes all the major AI countries except China. And I think about it like, I know that it's really difficult as to whether China is a friend or a foe or somewhere in between. But it's like climate change. You can't talk about global activity if you dismiss 1/6 of the world or more because of China's influence in Africa and Southeast Asia, many Southeast Asia countries. It's more than 1/6 of the world. And I just find this is a really difficult one to square. Because we are going to be buying, I think, until someone tells us not, services from China. We in some instances want to share data with China, like for, hesitate to say, pandemics and climate. So they need to be at the table, but on the other hand, they're a potential threat. So it's a really difficult one to square as what global means in this context. I mean, it's the same if you go back to financial services. It's quite hard for companies to trade to exist in China. It's a completely different culture, but much harder than it was in other parts of the world. So I think it's something we should aspire to. Whether it's actually achievable, I really don't know. I wanted to actually, can I also take, as I've got the window.
Please.
You talked about, Carl talked about data unions, and because the question was from Michael Nelson, why hasn't anyone brought up data trusts and data unions? Well, I think that was a very good question. And Carl talked about data unions. In the UK, we are doing a lot of work on data trusts in the broadest sense, not just data trusts that manage data on behalf of individuals, but data trusts or data institutions, as the Open Data Institute call it, that enable organizations, companies, government and companies, so the private and the public sector, to be able to share data in ways that the governance of that sharing is understood, that protects privacy and is legally and ethically compliant, whatever that means. We're doing a lot of work. It was the first recommendation, in fact, in the AI review that Jerome Pesenti and I did, that we saw the lack of that ability to share and exchange data was one of the inhibitors of the growth of AI. So there's a lot of work happening in the UK in that, what are the different legal mechanisms, how do you do it? And that could extend to sharing data between different countries and different jurisdictions as well over time. I think it's a very exciting area to explore.
Thank you. You brought up a couple of really interesting points, and I want to kick one of them to Dimitri, which is if you're trying to do governance particularly in AI and GPI without China at the table, is it meaningful? And I guess how can the countries that are involved in the OECD process square that circle? Because they want to be they're trying to establish principles and values, but of course they want to be global governance makers. They want to be global standard setters. How do you manage that tension?
So I think this question was in some ways easier to answer before TikTok, which sounds like a weird thing to say out loud, but I stand by it, which is in the sense that previously what you could envisage is that you effectively encircle China with standards. This was the logic of the CPTPP. And you effectively make it so that a standard is global minus the outliers, including China. And the way that those standards and those regulations are set up is that simply Chinese firms are not able to sell those types of services using those types of approaches to data to citizens outside of China. And that's sort of the way things kind of evolved in some ways. China has its own IT digital ecosystem that sells things to Chinese citizens, and the West effectively had its own with the Great Firewall in between the two. And that kind of worked. Now, I think, TikTok's a really simplistic way of putting it down, but TikTok was the first breakthrough where suddenly you had people all over the West using a Chinese developed product from a Chinese company in absolute en masse. And I think we're inevitably just going to see that more and more because the West has a lot of consumers with disposable income. If you are a company, you want to be selling to Europe and the US, and especially if you want to grow beyond the Chinese market. And increasingly, the Chinese entrepreneurs are going to get better and better at producing unicorns like TikTok that have immense appeal across the West. So that question's gotten harder because it's no longer simply a question of, well, we'll have a global standard and China will have its own domestic regime, and the two never shall the two meet, and we'll just both function in our own sandbox. I think now it's gotten more complicated, but I suppose the counterweight to that argument is, would any global standard that the Chinese government, for example, as its policies currently stand, any global standard it could sign on to, would that achieve any of the objectives that we've discussed today? And in a lot of areas, I think the answer is no. So what we are going to increasingly see, I think, is Western governments having to, as in a way the US flirted with ByteDance and with TikTok, having to effectively make some very big and potentially unpopular decisions where it effectively denies the access to immensely popular services developed under a standards ecosystem that the West doesn't subscribe to Western consumers who appear perfectly happy to bear that risk on their own, but which governments feel they are either not entering into that accord eyes wide open, or there should be some sort of effectively a nanny state or a national security argument to take that choice out of their hands. So I appreciate I just said everything's too hard, but
I can't believe that it's a minute to go. That is that's such a big discussion that we haven't got time to have. I disagree with you, Dimitri, actually. On that.
In the last minute, I want to give the floor to Carl Benedict Frey because I have one question that's really I'm very interested in. We're 13 days out from the Trade and Technology Council meeting in Pittsburgh. When you talk to people in the US, in USTR in particular, they are very cognizant of making sure that it serves the middle class. I think the European Union is as well, and often speak about dealing with workers in underserved communities through the establishment of new digital rules. What form could that take if you were advising the US government and the European Commission? How could they deal with that kind of question?
So I think the unfortunate answer is the only way of restoring the middle class is to create middle class jobs, and that means having innovation that create new sectors that absorb people. Yes, minimum wages can make existing jobs less lousy. Labor unions can play an important role, and there are other factors too. But in order to sort of recreate and reestablish the middle class, you need new businesses to come in to create new jobs for middle class people. And if we go back to 1950s, most jobs that people hold today didn't exist back then, right? They had to be invented. And I think one thing, and maybe this is going to be a source of further disagreement, is not something you send at the end of a session, but I do think it's important to keep in mind when we speak about, you know, standards and innovation, there is a potential trade-off there. So one of the reasons you want to have standards is that you want to exploit economies of scale. But if you're in the early stages of a technology, you want to be able to explore a lot of options. And one reason that the first industrial revolution happened in Europe and not in China was that Europe was fragmented, and people that, you know, didn't comply to the low regulations of the local guilds could leave to another labor market, another place, and pursue their idea there. So I think early on, and artificial intelligence is not yet a mature technology, you want some degree of fragmentation. And once you actually develop something that is meaningful and has an impact on the economy and productivity growth, you want to scale it, and that's where you need more standards. So I'm oversimplifying, and I'm not suggesting that you don't want any rules at all to begin with, but I do think that there is a difference whether you're in the very beginning of a technology cycle or at the end of it.
Well, that's definitely something we have. A fragmented environment where there isn't consensus is definitely something we have. And as was mentioned, this is an era of experimentation, both in innovation and in regulation. So there are 1,000 laboratories out there, and we're going to see what emerges as the most successful model. Thank you so much to Carl, Dimitri, Josh, and Wendy. This has been really interesting. And I think you have 3 minutes before the next session begins. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, I want to welcome everyone back from that break. It is really exciting to be able to moderate this panel, this star-studded panel. So I want to briefly introduce to you these extraordinary people that we're going to be able to speak to. So first, John Bansimer is the director of the Cyber AI Project, a senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, and a former Air Force officer. Dmitry Alperovich is the executive chairman at Silverado Policy Accelerator, the co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike. And finally, Carissa Nisha, I hope I didn't get that wrong. I never know whether to go like too German or not. The associate fellow for the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. So we have a really exciting group of people to talk to today, but I want to start quickly with John and start with talking about AI, especially kind of sitting from your position at Georgetown and your previous experience with artificial intelligence and the military. I'm really interested in how you think artificial intelligence is shaping geopolitics.
It would help if I got off the mute. So there we go. So that gets us started. And thanks, Jacqueline, for the introductions and as well just the opportunity to participate with these other great panelists. So it's a really interesting question in terms of how AI could shape geopolitics. So the first thing is I started considering kind of that aspect of it. Let's look at how are nations reacting. Right now, it's pretty clear that it's captured the attention of a lot of nations. Presently, by my count, over 30 countries have published AI strategies, as well as the EU. The EU's being, I think, the coordinated plan on AI. But I'd also highlight a really helpful overview of those strategies is in Stanford's HAI 2021 AI Index. It's got this wonderful chapter that kind of provides real nice short summaries of those respective strategies. I'm going to try and summarize all of them together because I do think it kind of illuminates a little bit of this geopolitical question that you ask. I'd characterize these strategies as largely aspirational, trying in essence recognizing the immense potential that AI can bring. Now, some of this may be a fear of just missing out on its new technology, but I think a much more generous view suggests that the nations are trying to leverage AI for societal goods, whether it's smart city initiatives, healthcare, transportation, and other types of industrial applications. At the same time, a lot of the strategies are seeking kind of the guide, the ethical development, and I know some of the earlier panelists have talked about privacy and bias, and that certainly comes to the fore in some of these strategies. Now, nearly every strategy recognizes the need for a talented workforce, and this is where I see the first kind of conflict, if you will. Not necessarily, it's a conflict over resources. It at least says that there's going to be a competition for AI talent until the education and the training pipelines can catch up so that supply and demand can kind of meet. Investment in R&D is also a common refrain, and I think that's for pretty logical reasons, right? It holds the promise to enhance existing technologies and capabilities across a broad spectrum of activities. That's, to me, one of the real benefits of AI is it can uplift so much, whether it's better medical diagnoses or autonomous vehicles, or relieving humans, quite frankly, from the tedious and the mundane types of work and the dangerous types of activities that we often engage in. So while the strategies, I think, do a good job of laying out the key objectives, what's missing in those? And for me, it's what's missing in most of these strategies is the means and the ways. And namely, how are you going to realize these strategies, or how are nations, not you, but how are nations going to realize these strategies, and what resources are going to be applied, predominantly in the way of funding. So that's one way to look and think of this. Another one is to move beyond the explicit strategies and think about how AI could shape geopolitics in the coming years. And here, AI, I think, is a lot like a lot of other technologies before. It can be harnessed for good and it can be harnessed for bad. So there's a lot of dual use implications that nations have to understand and be prepared to either counter or guide the technology towards broader societal goods. Now, for authoritarian regimes, AI capabilities can be used to increase the surveillance of its citizens. What in the past may have taken armies of human operators can now be drastically automated and reduced, the numbers of kind of humans that have to do this work, and the implications for privacy and security of those citizens in those countries, I think it's really, really concerning. And there's other capabilities as well that they could leverage, such as automated content generation that could in the future be used to spread disinformation, making those campaigns even more virulent. A couple of other quick points. I think that AI also brings its own set of vulnerabilities. For example, we know that the data that's used to train these systems can be poisoned, and the shared models and libraries that are used to build them, those can also be undermined through adversarial attacks. So when we look at those types of aspects, there have to be some ways that we can actually protect those. It, in many ways, calls to my mind the challenges we faced in cybersecurity for the last 30 years, something that I'm sure Dimitri knows a lot more about than me, but at least for me, the big question is, will AI open up a new frontier for attacks, or can we kind of at still early on in its development be able to shepherd its development to be more secure from the outset? And then finally, how can AI be used within strategic competition? Clearly, nations that are in competition are going to seek advantage. And in this context, AI, because of its broad applications, can support a variety of activities from the military to economic growth and those types of things. And we can discuss those as we move through the panel today. But I want to just wrap this up a little bit on a little bit more of a hopeful note, because it's really easy to focus on the challenges and the negative outcomes and think that AI is just opening up a new line of geostrategic competition. That's certainly a possible outcome, but for me at least, I see a lot of hope. First, AI progress has largely been an open endeavor. The dramatic gains we've seen in the last 10 years have been led through the research community and industry. Second, there's some great opportunities for allies and partners to work together on problems of merit. I think AI can be used to address a variety of systemic challenges. Global warming obviously comes to mind, but energy conservation, production, improving the outcomes, the health outcomes, I would say, for our citizens, all of those are pieces. So in short, I don't think it all has to be a geopolitical competition. And so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, John. And I think you kind of highlighted and foreshadowed where I was going to go here, which is I often see artificial intelligence and cybersecurity as kind of the Janus face of digital technology. So as we double down on artificial intelligence, often for good ends, right, it opens up these new vulnerabilities. And so I'm interested, Dimitri, from your perspective, kind of how do you see cybersecurity, and especially in the relationship with artificial intelligence, shaping geopolitics? And are these having the kind of an interesting relationship with one another where they're like somewhat kind of symbiotic?
Well, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here with such great panelists. So cybersecurity is all about exploiting flaws. And the more you introduce automation, the more you introduce new technologies, particularly complex technologies that have very sophisticated systems and system of systems, you inevitably have flaws that could be exploited by someone with a nefarious intent. And artificial intelligence, fortunately, is not immune to this. There's a growing area of research into something called adversarial artificial intelligence, which is how can you manipulate these systems to produce Iran effects. A lot of research has been done in the area of self-driving cars. A lot of the technology in self-driving cars is based on either radar or cameras. And what we find is that with very easy manipulation in the physical world, you can trigger the model to not recognize objects. So for example, having a slight paint applied to a stop sign, you can prevent the car from detecting that as a stop sign and potentially causing an accident. Of course, that's not necessarily a cyber attack, it's more of a physical attack, but you can imagine how some of those technologies can be applied purely in the virtual arena as well. And unfortunately, when you think about artificial intelligence, it's really, of course, is not a new field. It's been in development for many decades. And it's all about finding optimal solutions and approximations of optimal solutions to complex problems. So essentially, at the highest levels, you feed a bunch of data into the algorithm and you ask that algorithm to find what it thinks is the local maxima or minima, as the case may be, in that particular sphere. And it's very easy to skew that algorithm by introducing data that can slightly change things either at the training stage when you're making these algorithms in the first place. And of course, there's a lot of concerns these days, not just in the cyber realm, but how biases and training data, either at a racial level or some other societal level, can actually skew these algorithms in a very bad way in sort of unintentional circumstances. But imagine doing so through intentional mechanisms where you're able to hack into a system at the time that it's been trained and feed it a bunch of bogus data and can cause devastating cascading effects as a result once that system is deployed. Or you can do that if you understand it well enough at the actual recognition stage, where once the system is trained, it's deployed out in the field by understanding sort of the subtleties in the model. You can attack that and make the system do something that's unintended by its original creators. So in short, and I hate to be the Debbie Downer here, artificial intelligence poses significant concerns from a cyber perspective. And we don't have a lot of great solutions at the moment in being able to build models that are resilient to this, to these adversarial techniques. And of course, on a broader level, as we are accumulating more and more data, the previous panels talked about how these algorithms are data greedy, and even with GDPR trying to put a tax on the data, as one panelist has said, you still nevertheless have a situation where there is a hunger for training data in many of these systems, particularly deep learning systems and other supervised learning algorithms. And that presents enormous challenges when someone can just hack in and get that data, particularly if it's sensitive and personally identifiable, and cause lots of issues. So that's sort of the brief overview of the threats that we face in the cyber realm specific to artificial intelligence.
Well, I think these are really provocative and interesting ways to think about how these two kind of types of technologies, which are actually very interdependent and entwined and intermeshed, are shaping the ways in which states interact. Chris, I'd like to kind of zoom in a little bit on how these types of technologies are really being applied or affecting politics in the European context. And I'd love to hear, as any American does, how is this different than the US? Where are there kind of fissures between how the EU is approaching this versus the American approach to data, both AI and kind of securing it for cyber?
Absolutely. So first, turning to artificial intelligence, if we zoom out to the 1,000-foot level, one of the key distinctions that we're seeing here between the US and Europe is actually a distinction that John had just mentioned. And this is whether the focus is refracting this technology and thinking about how we use it through the lens of competition with China, or whether we're thinking about societal good. So it will come as no surprise to anyone here or listening in that the US is, of course, looking through this, refracting it through the lens of competition with China, thinking about how they can cooperate with Europe to push back and counter some of China's developments in this space. But if we zoom in a little bit more to the regulatory sphere in particular, there are pretty much three different regulatory distinctions between a US and European approach. The first question, of course, is how much to regulate it. The Danish white paper on AI specifically argued that the United States is not interested in regulating AI at all. Well, I think that's probably a bit of an overstatement. And we are seeing that there are, big tech in US who are pushing back on this idea of heavy regulation of AI, thinking about, again, what is that balance between innovation and regulation? The second big question and distinction is who is doing it. So in Europe, this is a very centralized approach. They just released their EU Artificial Intelligence Act back in April. And this is, of course, a very centralized approach to regulating artificial intelligence. On the US side, we're seeing a more decentralized approach. So while we've had a number of federal agencies weigh in with some guidance, we've seen OMB, we've seen the FTC. For the most part, a lot of the guardrails on artificial intelligence in the United States is at a local level and through a state level. That said, there is, of course, the third big distinction on how they're aiming to regulate it. And we've seen in the EU's Artificial Intelligence Act that they've pursued a more risk-based model. So if we're looking at artificial intelligence on a spectrum from the least risky applications to the most risky uses, they're thinking about regulation kind of along that spectrum. So either heavy regulation for the most risky uses, little to no regulation for some of the least risky uses. On the other hand, the United States is pursuing, along with this more state level approach, in the event that, federal agencies are weighing in, it is on a very sector specific basis. So they're looking at what are approaches to regulating artificial intelligence for consumer protection, finance. So they're certainly more focused on a sector specific model than the more risk-based model that Europe is putting forward. If we move a little bit over to the cybersecurity space, I would argue that there are sure some distinctions in how the US and Europe are thinking about this, but there's actually some good news here. And it's that there is on both sides of the Atlantic a growing shared perception. And I think they're really starting to think through a threat perception in a very similar way. And those ideas are converging. I think that, Russia and China in this case have done themselves no favors because that shared threat perception is largely guided by recent Russian and Chinese cyber attacks or intrusions. So I think in this case, we saw there's great energy in NATO surrounding this. After the recent summit, there was the joint communique outlining that a cyber attack could could trigger Article 5 in the future. So as there's immense energy in NATO to kind of tackle this issue, of course, we all know that there are a lot of things that have to get worked out. What constitutes a cyber attack that would trigger Article 5? And the attribution piece is, of course, really important here. And then how we think about cyber escalation is another. What does constitute defense in the cyber realm for NATO in this case? I would say another big thing that's very encouraging in this space is von der Leyen's State of the European Union address yesterday. In her State of the Union address, she really raises cyber attacks and protection and resilience in the cyber domain as a key priority in the EU. And I think that this national security lens that she used in that speech, there's a lot of convergence in how the United States have been thinking about cybersecurity over the past decade. So there's a really encouraging story there that, what does US-European cyber cooperation look like? But there's certainly, at least everyone's on the same page that this is a huge priority. And they're looking at it through that same geopolitical lens, which I think helps the situation a lot more than artificial intelligence, where there really are two different worldviews of artificial intelligence across the two actors.
So I want to pick up on something that you mentioned, Krista, which is the role that China is playing in how both Europe and the United States are thinking about AI and cyber. John mentioned great power competition. This is a kind of a theme that emerged under the Trump administration, was this idea. I'm a political scientist, this zero-sum world in which, there are kind of winners and losers. And this idea that data and information becomes a huge part of this competition, and increasingly actually antagonistic relationship between the US and China. So I'm interested, for all the panelists, where do you think where do you think like this competition is going in China, and the role of China in AI and cybersecurity, and how is that creating points of both friction and potential for cooperation between Europe and the United States? I guess I'll start with Dimitri because I see him first.
All right. Well, I think that China generally should pose great opportunities for collaboration with Europe. However, we're not seeing a whole lot of it right now. And it's actually quite puzzling to me where you have all these discussions about data localization, data privacy, most of them directed at the United States and not at China, which of course has tremendous capabilities in both data collection on European citizens, but also there's been plenty of documented cases that data goes directly to the Chinese government and facilitates their intelligence operations. So you have companies like Didi, for example, the famous ride-sharing vendor that people believe is collecting data and passing it to PLA officials and potentially officials in the Ministry of State Security on where people are riding and where they're going and their personal details. And I'm not seeing a whole lot of concerns from the European side about those types of issues. A lot of it is about Facebook and American companies, but not what, in the theoretical case, that data may go to US law enforcement, but not what is actually happening with these Chinese companies. So I think the US has more to do to educate its European partners on the threat, and hopefully the Europeans will be more receptive to that and not just pay close attention to the trade relationship that they have with China and the economic opportunities that it promises. On the cyber side, of course, the Chinese are engaged in a variety of nefarious activities, norm-violating activities. They've, of course, been doing economic espionage and stealing of trade secrets for 2 decades now against both American and European companies. Europe has traditionally not been forward-leaning in confronting the Chinese and demanding that activity stop. The US has been much more aggressive with both pressure from what it started under the Obama administration and continued under Trump and now Biden administrations. You now have, of course, public indictments, numerous public indictments since 2014 against Chinese officers and Chinese contractors that have been facilitating that activity. But now we're seeing the Chinese also getting more reckless and doing disruptive attacks like the massive exploitation of exchange servers that we saw back in March of this year from contractors to the Ministry of State Security. We're also seeing some of those contractors engaging in ransomware operations. So while we don't believe that those operations are done at the request of the Chinese government, the fact that the Chinese government is letting it happen, in some ways not unlike what is happening in Russia, with criminals there doing things with sort of tacit approval or at least looking the other way from the government. You're starting to see the same situation arising in China, not yet at the same level, but the trends are very disturbing. So you have a variety of things that are driving us towards broader conflict in the cyber realm, to say nothing of trade and overall geopolitical situation in South China Sea and Taiwan and all the rest of the problems that we have with China. So you do theoretically have the ingredients for closer collaboration between the US and Europe on this issue, but we just have not seen a whole lot of it to this point.
John, I'll turn to you for the next discussion, next part of it.
Sure. Dimitri covered the landscape pretty well, but for me, there's a couple of aspects here. To answer your question directly, I think the ride might be a little bumpy for a while, okay? And part of it is specifically to something that Dimitri laid out, right? It's that there's an obligation to protect our technology ecosystems, particularly against IP theft. We have been incredible. And when I say we now, I'm talking about European partners, the United States together. We've been particularly, we have benefited from really private sector talent and innovation. And so that protection of that intellectual property, I think, is really an aspect that we have to sustain and keep. The other one is, I think that we have shared kind of norms and values across the Atlantic around kind of producing and creating AI within kind of democratic values, right? Responsible artificial intelligence through kind of this ethical development. That authoritarianism streak that runs through this, particularly using it for surveillance, disinformation, and those types of things, I think that runs counter. But recently I was at the Global Summit for AI here in the United States, and Secretary Blinken came, and he had a quote that I pulled back because it kind of resonated with me, and I thought this was really good. And it was basic, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, okay, so bear with me. But in essence, it says it's not enough to kind of highlight the challenges of this kind of techno authoritarianism, but we also have to have the positive use case, right? What is it that the United States and liberal democracies like the United States can bring it forward? So in that particular aspect, this is the part where I do think that there's some great opportunities to partner with kind of like-minded allies and partners. Cooperation on standards, right? How can we best kind of shape the way that AI develops around those ethical standards, protecting privacy, those types of aspects, the security aspects of AI that we know that are going to be really essential as we continue to go forward. And then collaboration along core AI technologies as well, such as shared data sets. That may seem really strange, right? But actually shared data sets was one of the big things that uplifted AI development in the beginning, was the creation of these data sets like MNIST, and others that really sparked that innovation. We've got to find a way, I think, to be able to share things like that, as well as kind of research on some of those adversarial attacks that Dimitri did. So again, probably a little bit of a bumpy road, but I think we also need to take that positive aspect, that positive view forward too, showing a better way, if you will.
Yeah, I'd love to offer a couple more potential options on the affirmative agenda piece of this. I think one thing that's critical is exactly what John just mentioned, is how do we have those regulatory dialogues? And I think that, in my mind, is the starting point to have the greater standards conversation. And I think there are kind of two ways of approaching that. One is that you do have dialogues that are through some of the US federal agencies who are working on regulations, along with those European regulators. How do you have exchanges so that they can exchange viewpoints? But another way is, how do you bake these regulatory issues into the development of the technology? So are there opportunities here to create regulatory sandboxes where we're baking in democratic values, as well as trying to address some of these thorny regulatory issues that divide us on each side of the Atlantic from the ground up? Another option I would put forward is getting to some of this GDPR privacy piece. I know there's a lot of uncertainty within Europe about how GDPR fits into the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. So I know that's been a very large conversation, but another option here too is to think about how to include privacy as part of building AI as we go. So privacy preserving machine learning, when we can implement that, looking at federated learning as well as an option, in order to really try to make sure that that GDPR privacy issue does not capsize any kind of transatlantic cooperation moving forward. And then very briefly on the cyber side, I think there's also a lot of opportunity here. A good amount of that, though, I think, is replicating some of these projects like the Aegis project, which was funded by Horizon 2020. So thinking about how we open up our innovation systems. And then the second part is directly to a point that Dimitri made about how do we share information and make sure that we're continuing to share intelligence and information surrounding cyber actions moving forward.
Well, Chris, I want to come back to you because I always think it's interesting in these conversations, especially about from a European perspective, is to think about how the US is dealing with both NATO and the EU and kind of the different motivations between the two. So I was wondering if you could highlight for us, and as if you're speaking to the US Secretary of State, and they're trying to figure out what is our diplomatic best route here. Is it better for the US to try and propagate their version of kind of cybersecurity norms or AI norms through an institution like NATO, or are they going to see more success by engaging with the EU? Where are there kind of clashes between how the EU thinks about data and how NATO is evolving? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think this is a bit of a cop-out, but I would say they have to go to both. I think that if we're looking at the defense applications, the military applications, then NATO is very keen to do that, especially in cybersecurity with this recent Article 5 announcement. NATO also came out and said they want to be the platform where these conversations are had surrounding cybersecurity between the US and Europe. So I think that NATO has kind of volunteered in the cybersecurity domain. In artificial intelligence regulation, I think it has to be both. Also with cyber, especially as we think about how we engage the private sector. So to kind of have a cop-out, I would say they have to engage both at the same time, especially if US regulation on artificial intelligence is proceeding in a very sector-specific manner, then it seems that the EU is really going to be one of your primary vehicles to discuss that.
Dimitri, John, do you have any opinion on the difference between NATO and EU in these dimensions?
Well, I agree with Carissa that you have to try all mechanisms of education and finding common ground in every arena that you can find. Honestly, I think you're going to have more luck probably on a bilateral basis with countries than you will in these multilateral fora. And as we've seen with the Huawei situation, where the U.S. starting with the Obama administration and escalating significantly with the Trump administration, really trying to pressure European countries to not put Huawei equipment in their sensitive networks, and really getting nowhere, even with very close allies like the UK, until they deployed sanctions against Huawei and made it very clear to European partners and everyone else that there'll be severe impacts to Huawei's ability to deliver equipment because of those sanctions. And then you saw sort of very rapid change in position, both in Britain and other countries around Europe. There's limits, I guess, to persuasion on some of these issues, and sometimes we have to use hard power, including our power to sanction nefarious Chinese actors to actually get the right outcomes.
It's probably not a surprise that I'm in agreement with what Carissa said, given my time in the uniform. I certainly think that we have to engage both NATO and kind of on within the EU more broadly too. So within NATO, I think the defense applications are incredibly important, and we have good interaction to discuss those already. The challenges are pretty significant, right? The cyber challenges we've faced recently have been amazing. And one thing we haven't discussed at all is, could AI actually amplify those attacks in the future? Maybe they have, and my answer to that is I think they can, but right now the current kind of mechanisms are powerful in their own right. They're fast, they achieve the objectives, but if we improve our defenses, we have to also be mindful of the potential for AI to kind of amplify on that side. So that's on the NATO side. And then again, I want to reemphasize, to me, AI progress really, that we talk about the AI triad all the time, right? Compute and data and algorithms. But to me, the core is talent. And you have to have people. And that really, to me, that interchange of experience, of expertise across the Atlantic, I think, is really, that transatlantic partnerships, I think, is going to be extraordinarily important.
I want to get back to something that Dimitri mentioned for in part of his discussion, which was the Huawei conversation. So in the last few years, the United States has stood up a series of different commissions looking at artificial intelligence and cyber. And actually, interestingly enough, across all those commissions, there was a discussion about supply chain vulnerabilities. And actually, we started seeing under the Biden administration legislation and executive orders, thinking about kind of how do we think about supply chain vulnerabilities when it comes to AI and cyber. But that had some kind of cascading effects for allies and trade partners. How should the US and its partners in Europe be thinking about supply chain vulnerabilities? Is the US safe to kind of share supply chain? I mean, how do we think about what is national versus kind of what are things that we are willing to share? While we kind of brought up the 5G problem, but there are a series of different both hardware and then increasingly infrastructure issues that the US and its partners in Europe are having to grapple with. So I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts about that supply chain vulnerabilities.
Who is that directed at?
Whoever wants to start.
I'm happy to jump in on the, Dimitri, over to you.
No, please go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in on the semiconductor question, since this has come up a number of times, really in the last 24 hours even. During her State of the Union address, Ursula von der Leyen outlined that this is a massive priority for Europe. The numbers that were tossed around previously were 20% of the market for leading edge by 2030, which they'd like produced in Europe. So I guess if we take one step back, is this a reasonable thing to want to do? Americans will point at it and say, hey, listen, we'd love to be doing this with you. And I think that Intel's commitment within Europe's borders is one example of that commitment to do this. And I think, also just thinking through the European calculation, like this gets a little bit into some kind of nightmarish situation. But I mean, say China does make a play for Taiwan, say TSMC is off the table, say that the US is then unable to export semiconductors to Europe because they need to use them for their own domestic production. So of course, looking at that potential nightmare, what is Europe going to do but say that they need to have that production domestically? So I would say that all makes sense. What is a little bit of a head scratcher for me is this question of 20% of leading edge by 2030. That's bold. Currently, Europe has, of course, the supply chain in equipment with Dutch ASML. They're a piece of this puzzle for sure, but currently are not producing much at the leading edge. We're looking at Samsung, TSMC who are doing this. So the numbers are puzzling me a bit. The desire to do that makes a lot of sense to me if you look at the greater global strategic picture. So I will turn it over to someone else, but that's kind of at least where they're headed on semis in Europe, is to be able to create an EU Chips Act to be able to do just that.
No, that's a great point. I've been digging very deeply into this issue, which I think is one of the top national security issues right now, not just a technology one, but broader national security, and that is the supply chain for semiconductors, which is, of course, critical to everything that we've been talking about today and so much more. We really can't live without semiconductors at this point. There's no replacement for them. And this is a perfect opportunity for collaboration between the United States and Europe, because both countries obviously are very interested in investing in domestic productions. The reality is that neither has the capability to have independent supply chains in this particular space. Even the $52 billion that is allocated for the CHIPS Act in the United States, should it pass, and there's some real questions of whether it even gets through right now, is going to be a drop in the bucket to the investment that's actually needed to generate enough capacity, both on the leading edge, but also on the trailing edge, which, by the way, is where the majority of the demand still is across the board, in memory, in analog chips as well. So this is a perfect opportunity for the United States to look at allies, not just European allies, but Japan, South Korea, Israel, and others, and figure out a strategy of how everyone is going to invest resources into building production facilities, both fabs as well as packaging and other technologies related to the semiconductor production, and sort of almost have a give and take of, you guys focus on this area, we will focus on this other area, and everyone's going to contribute to the goal of having a supply chain that is immune to potential disruption in Asia. Of course, that's in everyone's benefit. It's going to benefit everyone economically, and it's just a perfect win-win scenario for all involved. There will probably need to be some sort of trade agreement to have essentially a truce on any action against each other for government subsidies in this particular sector, since everyone is going to be effectively subsidizing it. But it's very much doable, and it's something that is urgently needed.
My panelists have covered this extraordinarily well. I'll just say just two things. Is the first is the impetus for this is not just kind of supply chain security, but just the incredible demand that there is right now, right? And as we kind of reach the limits of Moore's law, right, the production requirements actually increase in some respects. And Dimitri, you hit it perfectly, right? The demand is just extraordinary because it's used in so many different mechanisms. There's another aspect, though, that I think is important. As you start to look at some of the biggest AI breakthroughs and the most powerful AI programs that we've seen, they are using extraordinary amounts of compute to do the training, and to actually do their running. So to actually execute them, the inference phase of this piece of it. I do wonder if at some point we don't get to a point where we think of a CERN-like capability for compute for large, really important types of ML applications that would be beneficial, again, to kind of for those larger societal issues and challenges that may actually benefit from large amounts of compute readily available for researchers.
Well, I would be remiss if I did not kind of jump a little bit more clearly into the topic of conflict and war, which is, if anyone has their AI buzzword bingo, we're going to go for killer robots now. So I'd like to start with John, especially from your Air Force background. I'm interested in kind of where you see the future of AI and autonomy when it comes to weapons and the autonomous use of lethal force. And I'd love to hear your perspective, and the other panelists as well, about whether you think Europe and the United States are on the same page about what the ethical limitations should be for these types of weapons.
I think we may be closer than people might think, okay? And I'll explain, I'll try and walk through. So I won't use the killer robots piece. I'll use lethal autonomous weapon systems. How about that? All right. And there's been a lot of work on this process already, right? The Department of Defense within the United States has really worked through this process. We need to also distinguish, I think, between kind of that kind of killer robot aspect and a lot of uses for this just for defensive autonomy, right? Being able, there's the potential for systems to come at fielded forces at such a high level that we need kind of much more autonomous systems that will allow us to protect both populations and fielded forces. So I think that that's one area. The second one is that I think that we've made an affirmative point of view that just by applying AI does not change the fundamentals of the law of armed conflict. And I do think that that is definitely an area where there is, Carissa can correct me, but I think there is strong agreement that the application of any of these systems must be within that kind of existing standards of law and ethics, particularly within the law of armed conflict. My biggest worry is that either rogue actors or other nations will not be similarly constrained. That's my biggest challenge. And so from that perspective, here's the other area I think of cooperation. We need to cooperate a lot to make sure that we're able to defend ourselves against those systems that may not be as similarly constrained.
I just want to add that I completely agree with John here. I do not understand the hand-wringing about autonomous weapons and concerns about laws of armed conflict. As John just said, you're going to be responsible as a nation state or even at the individual level for how you deploy any sort of technology, autonomous or not, and you're going to be held to account, hopefully, when you violate the law. And autonomous weapons, of course, are nothing new. We've had landmines since the 1600s. They're just a dumb, effectively autonomous weapon. And you know, there have been prosecutions throughout history of deployment of landmines in ways that are intentionally designed to harm civilians. So I see this as no different. You know, you're deploying a landmine or you're deploying something smarter than that, an autonomous aerial vehicle or land vehicle that will take action. You're still going to be responsible for how it is used and where you deploy it.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add here. John and Dimitri really covered it. Completely agree that I think the allies are much closer on this issue than a lot of people would suspect. I mean, I think NATO has been giving this a lot of thought as well in terms of what this should look like in the next 10, 15 years. And then I would, just foot stomp that this doesn't explode in any way, any kind of laws that we currently use to understand armed conflict. So just really to reiterate both of their points in total agreement that there is a little more convergence than we think here, and we can use those current frameworks to think through this same challenge.
Yeah, I think that's important sometimes to identify not only where there are points of friction, but where actually we have very similar kind of views. Just to kind of like round out this discussion about conflict, I'm interested in, from all the panelists, kind of how you think these emerging technologies, so I'll be honest, actually, cyber, every time somebody calls cyber an emerging technology, I do cringe a little bit. But how we think about, you know, how artificial intelligence and kind of the other side, cyber threats and cyber vulnerabilities are going to change the way that states fight, and most particularly the way NATO fights.
Yeah, I want to just add one comment that was mentioned previously about NATO Article 5. I would caution people from reading too much into it. You know, if you look closely at what NATO Article 5 actually says, it says that, you know, if an attack on one nation's state within NATO is undertaken, then other nation states will assist in restoring security to that nation state. So if you think about the application of that in cyber, it does not necessarily mean that, you know, let's say if Russia attacks Estonia, that we're going to go to war with Russia. It may mean that we'll just provide security assistance to Estonia to restore their networks back to, you know, a pristine state that they were at prior to the attack. So it does not necessarily mean that we'll get into an automatic conflict with another power that may attack in a significant way a nation within NATO. So some of the concerns I think about that are overblown. But nevertheless, when you start thinking about applications of cyber to armed conflict, they can be significant. And I think the significance in particular that has not been paid a lot of attention to in public discussion is the implication to the reliability of weapon systems. And the ability to disable them through a cyber attack, either in advance of a conflict or during a conflict. And as more and more of these systems become networked, as more of them become essentially software technologies, you have phenomenal implications of ability to use cyber to interfere with their operations and really enable the other side to lose confidence in their own weapon systems. And that's something that I think is particularly where cyber can be a huge force multiplier in conflict.
Go ahead, Carissa.
Also, on the NATO piece, NATO is working on an AI strategy that I believe is supposed to be released in the next month or two. So this has been a high priority for the alliance. I know ethical use is kind of front and center of that strategy. So they are really thinking through what this looks like. I would say another key NATO area on all of this, and this is something where there's been talk of a lot of NATO-EU cooperation, is in the domain of space and how that relates to kind of both artificial intelligence and cyber. So this is another big NATO priority area that they've outlined, kind of their key priorities over the next couple of years, and have really been thinking about what that means, again, in the context of other goals that they have, whether that's the Sustainable Development Goals or NATO 2030 and kind of where they envision the alliance over the next 10 years. Then the last piece here is I think NATO is also very focused on the innovation piece. They recently announced Diana, their Defense Innovation Accelerator of the North Atlantic. So I know they're hoping to get that online in the next year or so. So I will be very curious to see kind of one, how something that's focused on technologies at a very low technology readiness level jives with kind of the capabilities guys over there who are focused on things that are much, that are ready to field. So I think that will be an interesting tension to watch in that. But I'm also curious to see how that innovation accelerator will also prompt some innovation in the artificial intelligence space or perhaps in cyber defenses. So very exciting announcements on the NATO front. And I think they are very intent on looking at, the space domain, again, innovation acceleration, and then also their artificial intelligence strategy.
Just a couple of very small little pieces to add because it's been very well covered. When I think about what will happen, right, first of all, there's this term, the OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, act, right? And most likely what happens in a situation as this becomes more prevalent is that OODA loop gets compressed. Decision cycles are going to be much more compressed, which means that you, by virtue of that, it almost inherently means that you have to depend more on automation. So the TEVV, right? The testing, the evaluation, the validation, and the verification of these systems is going to become critically important as they're fielded to make sure that they do what we want them to do. And hopefully, we haven't talked about this yet, but can hopefully kind of explain how they kind of got to that if necessary, or at least for the purposes of looking backward in terms of how did it reach its conclusion. So I think that's the other aspect that I think will be important in this as we try to steer this in a positive way.
All right, so we have just 2 minutes. So I'd like to ask each of you, just briefly, what do you think is the most enduring challenge here, or and then what is the biggest opportunity? It's kind of a big grouping of technologies, but broadly, just as kind of our lessons as we leave. I'll start with Dimitri.
Well, I'm a believer that it's not the technology that poses the challenge, it's the people that operate those technologies. And I think the biggest challenge, unquestionably, both in technology field and geopolitics, is China and the rise of China, and how we all collectively, not just the United States, but everyone on this planet, manage that and try to avoid conflict in the coming decades. And obviously AI, semiconductors, cybersecurity, all the issues that we've discussed play into that. And it's going to be fascinating to watch for sure. We just have to remember the old Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting time, is actually a curse.
Carissa?
Yeah, I would say that if we think about transatlantic cooperation, I think one of the biggest issues that we're going to have to grapple with are these regulatory divergences. And I think that unlocking that and being able to align just enough to work together is going to really allow us to focus on the challenges that Dimitri just outlined, and are going to enable us to cooperate together, both to counter China in these spaces, but also to provide that affirmative agenda to bake those democratic values directly into the technology as we create it.
As you've probably been been able to see from my comments, I'm pretty much an optimist here. So I actually think that we're going to be able to find these areas of cooperation transatlantically. From the biggest challenge is the fact is this technology is very accessible. There's the algorithms are not really that, that particularly challenging for a relative for people. It's all open. The research is almost all published, etc. So there's a variety of actors that have access to this. The opportunity is huge, though. Just looking at things like looking at protein folding and what we're trying to do there, just in one small area, I think AI can actually benefit. It's that rising tide that lifts all boats. And so that I do see as the opportunity. So thanks again for the opportunity to participate today.
Thank you so much. I'll just take it from here to say a few brief words of thank you. My head is really full with new insights, new perspectives, but also lots and lots of questions. I feel like the field that we've touched upon today took us from the European Commission to Beijing, from avoiding harm to avoiding cyber war. And even if we spend 3 intense hours with lots of questions and back and forths, we have not solved the question of what types of policy are best going to sustain our democracy, our rule of law, our human rights, and our peace. So I hope that you will continue to engage with us. I looked at the participant list and I saw names that undoubtedly have roots all over the world. So I really want to thank you for your patience and your stamina to stay with us for this seminar. In particular, I want to thank Tyson and Jacqueline for moderating these sessions. Much appreciated. And well, do stay in touch with us. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.